that Iran's situation back at home is not such that either the population nor the state of the economy would be making Iran strong enough, or would make Iran strong enough for a regional escalation in which it would be dragged in.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest situation in the Middle East, and I'm delighted to be joined by Adnan Tabatabai. He's a founder and CEO of CARPO, a think tank based in Bonn in Germany. He's also the author of the book Morgen in Iran and is consulted by European policymakers and businesses on Iran-related affairs. Adnan, really appreciate your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
I want to start just by talking about the suspected Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, because that really was the trigger, I suppose, for what we've seen since. How was that viewed at the time in Tehran?
I think it is fair to say that that crossed the red line. Technically speaking, this was an attack on what you can define as Iranian soil. And this is also what the narrative back home was spun around. Or we actually have to say that obviously a building which is called a diplomatic mission or diplomatic building is then viewed as territory of that country represented in this building. And this is where I think Israel crossed the red line. It was clear for the Iranians that it was Israel, and that made the whole thing slightly different than before that April 1st incident.
And of course, I suppose the Israelis would say they were targeting an Iranian commander. I've heard some people make a comparison with the US taking out Qasem Soleimani back in 2020. Is that an appropriate parallel?
Well, that happened on a highway close to Baghdad airport, which is obviously not anything close to a consular or embassy building. So I think a building that is declared as an embassy or a consulate, it has to be regarded as such, regardless of who is inside that building.
And in terms of the response we've seen from Iran and this attack that they launched over the weekend on Israel itself, what were their calculations when they were deciding how to respond?
I believe it is fair to say that Iran wanted to do something that it had never done before, and to do something people wouldn't expect. So I would also consider myself someone who watches Iran for quite some time, and I also didn't expect an attack like that happening. Coming from Iranian territory, also the sheer scope of missiles and drones being launched. So Iran wanted to do something that is unprecedented. At the same time, and that's the continuity of similar things Iran has done in the past, Iran wanted to make sure that nothing big happens in terms of casualties or actual lives being taken, similar to the retaliatory attack to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that you just mentioned. So here we saw a mix of breaking out of previous behavioral patterns in such circumstances, while at the same time some continuity.
And will they judge the operation to have been a success? I mean, in Israel, they're viewing it almost as a success because of the success of the Iron Dome in preventing too much damage. Will Iran look at it and think, actually, we would have wanted to have sustained more damage on Israel?
Look, James, the interesting thing is that there is a beauty in what you just said. I mean, beauty sounds a bit too euphemistic. Let's say a silver lining in what happened. And that is that the Israeli side can claim victory for its defense capabilities. And they are doing that, as you just outlined. And the Iranian side are celebrating this as a huge success in saying this was just something that happened with us giving them more than 10 days to prepare for our attack. First. Second, what our main goal was, this is what you hear from Tehran, was to hit the airport in the Negev desert from which the attack on Damascus was launched. And this is exactly where some of the missiles went through. Now, some would argue these missiles went through the Arrow and Iron Dome system because they were going somewhere where they wouldn't do any harm. The Iranian side would say, this was a significant message to send. And if we want, next time we wouldn't give you enough time ahead of our attack and we could do more harm. So we have victory speeches on both sides, if you will.
And give me a sense, if you can, Adnan, on what Iran's military capabilities are at the moment. I mean, had they wished to sustain more damage to Israel, what could they do?
To me, that's honestly that's a question mark as well, and I would overstretch my, let's say, knowledge if I were to tell you what exactly Iran could do. At this moment, I think it is fair to say that Iran knew that, as the Israeli media stated and as officials stated, 99% of those things that were launched would be intercepted. It's difficult for me to assess if in any scenario that could be different. So I would leave that to military experts.
Does Iran want escalation at this point?
Certainly not. And the reason for that is that Iran's situation back at home is not such that either the population nor the state of the economy would be making Iran strong enough, or would make Iran strong enough for a regional escalation in which it would be dragged in. So I think Iran's goal, regardless of whether they achieve it or not, but Iran's goal with this operation was to de-escalate while escalating, to somehow seek something which is a bit of a mini shock and awe, if you will, and in one way or another show, stop messing with us, and then nothing more will happen. Whether that is accepted in the region, whether that is accepted in Israel or the US, we obviously don't know. At this point, it seems as if in the US that is accepted for things to now really calm down. On the Israeli side, I don't know, that this would have to be answered by those who know better than me about Israeli politics.
Well, that's the crucial question now. We wait to see what Israel does next. I mean, let's say Israel did launch an attack, and we can talk in a moment about what those options are. But let's say it launched an attack on Iran now in the coming days and weeks. Would Iran then feel duty bound to respond again in turn? And does the risk of escalation come from that?
Yeah, I mean, they're vowing basically to do so. They're already saying this. It wouldn't take. It would just take seconds for us to retaliate if there was an Israeli attack on our soil. And here I go back to the point that Iran is breaking out of formerly known behavioral patterns. If you had asked me like 8 months ago, I would say no, Iran would not retaliate if there was to be an Israeli attack on Iranian soil. Now I'm not so sure. We have to say that the red lines that may have existed in the tacit agreement between both countries have been pushed significantly farther. And if now attacking Israeli territory without doing harm can be matched by attacking Iranian territory without doing harm, then that possibly can make us see a scenario in which Israel strikes something in Iran without Iran feeling the need to respond. If Iranians get killed, regardless of military personnel or civilians, that's probably a different story then.
It's really interesting, Adnan, what you just said there about, Iran now is maybe in a different position. Its thinking is different from 8 months ago. Can you just expand on that? What do you mean by that?
I think this is something that has been in the making. Um, Iran generally, when looking in its affairs with particularly, let's say, Western states or adversaries, and of course the US here is the biggest player, Iran always sought to either seek deterrence towards the US to keep the US away from doing harm to Iran. For deterrence, it had its means of asymmetric warfare, being aligned groups, the so called non state actors, at times called proxies. Iran has its nuclear program, which it sometimes turned to a deterrence factor, which we may see in the future again. And the alternative to the deterrence bit was the diplomacy bit, and diplomacy happened in 2002 when Iran was seeking this grand bargain back then with the George W. Bush administration, which was rejected, and the diplomacy bit happened throughout the JCPOA, which was also a big failure. And what this can lead up to is that we will not be able to define a good relationship with the US through diplomatic means, but we will have to scare them to some sort of grand bargain. And this can make Iran a more dangerous actor, I believe. And a new generation comes up in military and strategic circles in Iran that may be fostering this line of thought.
Of the potential Israeli responses, what would be the most inflammatory? Would it be an attack on Iran's nuclear program?
We have to appreciate the fact that such attacks in the past have already happened. So there had been cyber attacks, there had been presumably drone attacks on nuclear sites, some sort of sabotage acts happening on the ground. Something like that has happened before. And I think any strike or operation that does some damage, but not significant damage, it's difficult to define that. But I would say if we saw damage that can be, from which Iran can recover in a matter of, I don't know, 2 weeks, 6 months, 2 years, then probably nothing will happen. If military personnel gets killed, if civilians get killed, then of course that's a huge different story, and brings us to completely new calculations.
I want to ask you about whether you think that the way Iran targeted Israel directly has actually been counterproductive in the sense that the West now appears to be more solidly behind Israel than it was 2 weeks ago when there was growing criticism of their operations in Gaza. And now it feels like Netanyahu's position is somewhat, although I don't know overstate it, somewhat more secure in Israel. And certainly Western support for Israel is somewhat more secure. So, from that perspective, was it counterproductive what Iran chose to do?
I think that is a very fair argument to make. And I think this was part of the reason why some thought Iran would not retaliate for that attack. But we have to also take into consideration that PR calculations sometimes undermine military posture. And I think here we have basically the higher weight of military and strategic calculations over some thoughts about PR, about the pressure that is on the Netanyahu government. And this is why Iran chose to, in fact, launch this attack. I think one interesting nuance here is that you can now hear the debates in Iran saying the US is on Israel's side when it comes to defending Israel, but there is conviction in Iran that there is no such support for the US should Israel want to attack Iran. So they are making this differentiation between how far the US would go in support of Israel.
That's really interesting there, and I'd be grateful for your insight, Adnan. What are the big conversations happening in Iran at the moment in terms of how to respond at the moment? I mean, so often in the West, we obviously talk about the conversations in the US and the UK and Europe, and of course within Israel. But what are the conversations happening in Iran?
I mean, it's obvious that there are multiple conversations that go in different directions and that there are different views on what happened. What is clear is that probably a quite small portion of the population is entirely happy about what happened, may not even be worried about consequences, is completely convinced that this showed Iran's strength and this will play out in Iran's favor in every respect. Then there are those who, as patriots or as patriotic Iranians, like the fact that Iran launched this attack, and you will be surprised what kind of people suddenly praise Iran's military for what it did, while at the same time being very worried. We saw people lining up at gas stations overnight. These people can be happy about the strike in terms of our country did something big, while at the same time being very worried. And there's, of course, certainly also a big chunk of the population which is just thinking this will make the whole situation of our country even worse. The hardships will exacerbate. So there is definitely also this big part of the population. Right now, obviously, in the public debate, which is quite regulated, you see a lot of a fanfare around what happened, and of course, almost exclusively a positive spin of the events.
How would you rate the chances of Israel choosing to respond by attacking one of the groups seen as an Iranian proxy, so doubling down on their attacks in Gaza on Hamas, or targeting Hezbollah, or, I don't know, in some way trying to target the Houthis? I mean, to what extent do you think that might be the Israeli response that we see?
Obviously, that would be, again, it sounds euphemistic, but that would be a de-escalatory measure to take. In terms of what matters very often in these circumstances is to save face. You can do that while really showing also or sending a signal that nothing else is going to happen. And of course, that might appear to be the likeliest scenario. Those or the most likely scenario, those that look at Israel and whose comments I tend to read here and there, are worried about Bibi Netanyahu actually seeking to expand this, and to seeking to drag the US into this even more. So that is the point probably which is the most concerning, which may make us think that they go beyond attacking Iran aligned groups in Iran's neighborhood.
And is it fair to use that term proxy as a kind of catch-all term for Hamas and Hezbollah and for the Houthis, or is it more nuanced than that? I mean, how close would you say the links are between Tehran and each of those groups?
No, I think the notion of proxy is really misleading, because it would suggest to you that all the calculations that these different groups have are totally in line with what Iran wants, whereas it is not. The difference between Iran seeking alignments with armed groups in specific countries to how other states use mercenaries, for example, the difference here is that these groups have indigenous agendas that drive them towards resisting either their own country, resisting the US presence, or something else. And then you basically cultivate a worldview, an anti imperialist worldview that has much less to do with religion, but much more with power in the world, the global order. And then you have them with you in line with your mainstreamed worldview, if you will, for certain actions. But the groups in Iraq, particularly in Iraq, they are also competing among each other. Who has the most street credibility, for example? The Houthis or the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen has its own internal power struggle against other parties in Yemen. And so these groups at a certain point have their national agendas, which weighs more than the Iranian wish list or the Iranian demand that might be in the room, which is why I would really say that what we are currently also saying is a mutual form of emancipation, not alienation, but emancipation between these groups also doing their own thing, and now Iran also saying we no longer need the plausible deniability of attacks being carried out by these groups. We're doing it from our own soil, and that's the new era we're currently entering in.
On the topic of Iran's global alliances, I want to ask you about their relations with Russia, because a lot of the narrative now in the West is about this the fear of the rise of the so-called CRINCS alliance of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And obviously, we've seen in Ukraine, for example, Russia using weapons supplied by Iran with the Shahed drones, but also from North Korea as well. And it's interesting that in Syria, for example, the airspace is essentially controlled by Russia. And yet, of course, we had this airstrike on the Iranian consulate, which has raised some question marks. How would you sum up relations at the moment between Moscow and Tehran?
Yeah, I would assume. I mean, on the one hand, we have to say that these relations are deepening. These relations, particularly since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, of course, and Putin's actions in Ukraine. And the depth of these bilateral relations is growing. And we have constantly seeing not only military to military relations expanding, but also visa-free travel is now happening. A Russian bank has opened a branch in Tehran. Russian there are now teachers in Iranian schools teaching Russian. So these things are even entering in very slow pace, however, the cultural sphere. But this alliance is, of course, an alliance of necessity. Iranians and Iran as a country had always been hoping to find a well-functioning modus operandi with Europe in particular. And while that is now, since that is out of reach, the only viable alternative for Iran is to reach towards Russia, and unless engaging Europe would bring a more beneficial alternative in terms of economic dividends or strategic dividends than the alignment or the partnership with Russia currently, I'm afraid it will stay like that. There will be no shift towards Europe unless there is this new alternative on the table.
It's fascinating what you just said there. So there are now Russians teaching Russian in Iranian schools.
I mean, I don't know whether they're Russians, but Russian is taught in some Iranian schools, and there is also Iranian teachers being dispatched. I'm unaware of the scope and numbers, but there are basically now even cultural exchange programs happening, and with visa regulations for Iranian citizens being catastrophic to travel to Europe, traveling to St. Petersburg is easy to do. So as easy as that, relations also from bottom up can slightly and slowly change.
One of the conversations that is also now happening is, Israel pushing for the West to impose fresh sanctions on Iran. What impact would that have?
Look, it's I think it is fair to say that you wonder what sort of sanctions regime you now want to impose on Iran that you haven't for the past decades. And part of the Iranian Russian alliance or partnership right now is also about circumventing sanctions. Iran has developed multiple methods, multiple ways to circumvent sanctions, um, which ultimately will allow the country to survive in the sense that its economy will not collapse and the country will keep on running, so to speak. But it does not mean that surviving comes with economic relief for the population. It doesn't come with Iran being less securitized. So sanctions are basically the one behavioral pattern that Western countries towards Iran are incapable of changing. But I understand that there is this need to do something, and short of military action, the only coercive measure you can think of are sanctions.
And when you say that, for example, countries such as Russia are able to help Iran avoid sanctions, how exactly does that work?
I mean, obviously, there are then some illicit trade routes I am unaware of when it comes to the details, but this is what you're hearing. And interestingly, there's also the Iranian knowledge transfer to Russia to circumvent sanctions. So this goes both ways. Iran has been seeking economic integration with its neighboring countries, obviously in slow pace because of the effect of U.S. secondary sanctions, and obviously these countries do not want to alienate their trade relations with the US. But for Iran, it's always about finding arteries into its market to find a way to keep its economy going, to keep some foreign trade alive. And here, obviously, a big country like Russia can be helpful.
How strong would you say the Ayatollah and the regime in Tehran is at the moment?
Well, if you define strong in the sense, or if you define strength in the sense of cohesion within the state apparatus, it's super strong. If you define strength in the need or lack thereof to, in fact, be repressive at home, and to impose control and any sort of repression, then of course it's a weak leading elite in the country, because we are seeing so many restrictions in so many parts of life of the population. So here we really have to be clear in what ways we are defining this. Obviously, there is the context of Iran is more securitized than ever in every respect, and that has to do partly with the looming power transition that will come one day when the current supreme leader has to be succeeded by someone else, and the big power struggle that comes with it.
And to what extent are domestic considerations and the strength and security and the position of the regime actually affecting Iran's policy towards Israel?
I mentioned the patriots or the patriotic Iranians a few minutes ago. So, of course, people who have been critical of a lot of things Iran has been doing, the moment Israel kills Iranian generals, even if it's a Revolutionary Guard commander, this is when some sentiment of patriotism kicks in. This was the case when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. You will remember the huge marches of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in the streets of Iran. This does not mean that these people are happy with the current state of affairs inside the country, not at all. But this means to some extent that there is some sort of rallying around the flag if these things escalate. And of course, there can be this calculation or the argument made, so let's seek more escalation in order to make sure that all people are behind us. But again, if your country suffers economically and if your people's purchasing power is decreasing more and more, it's difficult to really impose that on the population. So I do not think that that's the logic that the country or the leaders are currently following.
Just finally, Adnan, and we really appreciate your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. Where do you see, and I know this is difficult to know, I mean, this is speculation and we will have to wait and see, but if you had to look into your crystal ball, how do you see things playing out vis-a-vis Israel and Iran in the next few weeks?
Yeah, that's it's a difficult one. And I think so probably it seems as if there will be some sort of Israeli action. It's likely that this action will be not such that Iran feels the need to launch another attack. If Iran does not launch another attack, we may be in a new equation when it comes to looking at how this horrific Gaza crisis can come to an end. Possibly this is the time when everybody realizes there has to be something done before this explodes into something untamable, so to speak. And my hope, that's a weak hope, but my hope is that U.S. elections are going to be a big factor here, and that the Biden administration will do much more than it has done in the past 6.5 months to invest into stopping the war in Gaza. So I think now it's really clear what this will lead to, and maybe, but that's really more hope than expectation. Here we can see a de-escalation after this event over the weekend.
Just briefly to follow up on that, so that's really interesting. So you think actually, even though the irony of the past fortnight with this kind of escalation between Israel and Iran is that attention has been turned away almost from Gaza, actually it comes down to Gaza, and what happens in Gaza could be the solution, or the could explain a lot what happens next between Israel and Iran.
No, absolutely. That's really necessary. I know that there is this tendency to try and say this has nothing to do with Gaza. Also, the attacks of Ansar Allah or the Houthis in Yemen in the Red Sea, or the operations launched from Iraq. This is about Gaza. And this will have to be addressed explicitly as something that came out of the Gaza conflict. There is, of course, more to it when it comes to Iran-Israel relations, but you need sparks to make a bigger explosion. And Gaza is definitely a spark in the tensions that exist in this region, which is why that conflict needs to come to an end, at least to a ceasefire, to then maybe find a path towards some sort of political process.
Adnan, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.